I mean, you have an amazing head of hair, man, and I'm sure you could grow a good beard, even though you don't think so. Like, tell us what you did. Talk to us about these natural therapies for men and for women. We've kind of touched on this a little bit so far. Obviously, eat a nutrient-rich diet. Where do we go from there? Like, what did you do? How did you improve your hair for men and for women? Let's lay it out for them in terms of these natural options beyond the drugs, like what they can do.
Sure. So the first thing is that we go back to that two-step equation. How do you improve hair loss? Well, we know that almost everybody has pattern hair loss, so we have to figure out how to target DHT. That's the first step of the equation for the overwhelming majority of people. And then the second part of that equation is you have to identify your causes of hair shedding and you have to course correct so that you can normalize that hair cycle and stop the acceleration of this process. But let's go back to that DHT equation first, because we've talked about the evidence supporting the claims that DHT is this causative agent in pattern hair loss. We know that mechanistically it induces that signaling protein transforming growth factor beta 1. It leads to apoptosis in epithelial cells of the dermal papillae cell network. We also know at a bird's eye view that men who lack the ability to produce DHT don't go bald, that men who were castrated before puberty don't go bald, and then if you give men DHT injections, they'll go bald even if they've been castrated. So there's a lot of causative action there, but the questions remain around several facets of hair loss pathology and specifically DHT itself. So for example, why does DHT increase in a balding scalp? A lot of people argue that there's this genetic sensitivity to pattern hair loss and that the reason why we develop DHT in balding scalps is because of our androgen content in our blood and because of our ability to convert 5-alpha reductase into DHT at the cell sites, and also just because we've got the genes for it. And that might be true, but the irony behind that is that DHT is also what causes or associates strongly with better facial hair regrowth, with better chest growth. So it's this hormone that's paradoxical. It causes hair loss in the scalp, but then it grows hair in the beard, it grows hair in the chest and in other parts of the body. So when I saw this anecdote when I was in college, it's not even an anecdote, it's been well demonstrated in the literature. When I saw this relationship, I thought that's really puzzling. How does the genetic sensitivity argument address something this paradoxical? And there have been a lot of attempts to say that there are certain androgen receptor co-activators, things like HIC5, ARA55, that for whatever reason, when DHT attaches to a cell site in the scalp, these androgen receptor co-activators activate, make the effects of that androgen way more intense, and then cause miniaturization. And for whatever reason, they're absent in beard and chest hairs. So you hear these things and you think, well, great, okay, is it genetic predisposition that causes this co-activation of these androgen receptor cofactors? And then there's no information about that. And you get this default answer back to genetic sensitivity, genetic sensitivity, genetic sensitivity. And the reality is that the DHT pattern hair loss argument is absolutely true. It's causative, but it's just one facet of why we go bald. And it's not complete. There's still a lot that we don't know about this argument. And when you zoom out and you look at the histological features of a balding scalp, when you look at the morphological features of the skull itself for people who end up going bald, there are some things worth noting, and there are inferences that you can make to begin to connect HIC5, ARA55 co-activation, DHT's arrival, the induction of transforming growth factor beta 1, against all of the other things that we see in the scalp environment that precipitates pattern baldness. So that was the basis of the first paper that I published. It was the fact that there is a lot of evidence that there are other factors at play here, and that while finasteride is sort of like this awesome nuclear option for people who want to reduce DHT everywhere, there might be other reasons outside of genetics as to why we end up increasing hair loss or seeing increased hair loss at the top of the scalp, but not elsewhere in our body, and that there's this dependency on DHT. So interestingly enough, when you talk to dermatologists about pattern hair loss, if they're very familiar with examining people's scalps, almost all of them will say that 80% of the individuals who they examine those individuals with AGA will have really, really tight scalps. And this is important because it suggests that these muscles that surround the scalp perimeter are chronically contracted. Now, the muscles that surround the scalp perimeter that are chronically contracted, they're all anchored to this dense, fibrous, fascia-like membrane that stretches across the top of our scalp like a drum, called the Galea aponeurotica. And this tissue resides directly below the hair follicles. And what's interesting is that when you look at the muscle contractions of these things around the scalp perimeter, it pulls the Galea taut like a drum, and that creates tension. And if that tension is chronic and persistent, a lot of interesting things start to happen in the body. For example, let's look at what happens with tension-mediated environments or pressure-mediated environments or inflammation-mediated environments in other tissues of the body. Well, in the prostate, pressure induces DHT, transforming growth factor beta 1, and scarring or fibrosis. It's the same things that you see in a balding scalp. You see fibrosis at each stage of hair follicle miniaturization alongside those other mediators. In Dupuytren's contracture, when people have a tendon that contracts like this and it gets stuck, you see increased androgen activity, increased transforming growth factor beta 1, increased fibrosis. Same in the balding scalp. Well, if you look at the eyelids of patients with Graves' disease, where they retract, you look at that chronic contracted eyelid, it's the same exact signaling proteins. So who is to say that this relationship between a chronically contracted scalp getting pulled down tightly, creating tension across the top of the scalp, might not be doing the same thing in pattern baldness? Well, interestingly enough, researchers have modeled two-dimensional von Mises models where the frontalis muscles of the scalp and the occipital muscles of the scalp are contracted. And the tensile pattern that is created perfectly aligns with the progression and patterning of male pattern hair loss. And what's more interesting about that is that we know that tension in any tissue induces those same androgen cofactors for the androgen receptor and induces transforming growth factor beta 1. If that tension is persistent and high enough, it translocates out of those cell sites and presumably can enter and begin to influence cells above them, like the dermal papillae cell network. So there's really strong mechanistic evidence that these scalp perimeter muscles might have something to do with pattern hair loss. And then the question is, what about treating them? Well, we have another manuscript in peer review right now that demonstrated that injecting Botox across the scalp perimeter led to injecting Botox across the scalp perimeter over a 10-month period, 2 rounds of injections for patients with androgenic alopecia, led to a 75% response rate, meaning that 75% of individuals saw some degree of hair regrowth. And the average amount of hair regrowth seen across responders and non-responders combined, 18%. Now, the reason why this is significant was because the pilot study that conducted this research by Dr. Front, it used the same exact hair counting methodologies that Kaufman used to get finasteride FDA approved. And so you actually can make a somewhat scientific, crude comparison between the 2-year outcomes of finasteride, which get a 10% increase in hair counts, versus the 10-month outcomes with Botox, which led to an 18% increase in hair count with roughly the same response rate. So are we nuking our levels of DHT to lower that hormone with a drug? And are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Now, since Dr. Front's study has come out, there have been several investigations in Chinese populations, in Indian populations, in Caucasian populations, replicating Dr. Front's results. A 75 to 79% response rate and regrowth metrics that range from 18 to 21%. In fact, when you combine Botox with finasteride, you can see hair count increases of 35% over a year period. And that is significantly cosmetic. And now we're talking about combination therapies that really move the needle. So when I was frustrated with my treatment options, I looked at a lot of this research and I thought to myself, well, you can probably elicit the same exact mechanisms by massaging the scalp perimeter to take these muscles out of chronic contraction. And I noticed myself that I kind of fit the candidate for who would be a good responder to these botulinum toxin therapies. I had a super tight scalp. I'd had a tight scalp since I entered puberty. I am super susceptible to stress. And it's no wonder why I started balding earlier, given a reflection of my diet, my environment, my lifestyle, how I was living during puberty and through high school, and then also, the fact that I had this really tight scalp, and I also had DHT levels that were at the level required to cause hair follicle miniaturization with my genetic predisposition. So I started to massage the scalp perimeter of my scalp to just see how outcomes would grow. Now, simultaneously, there was evidence that you also could target other facets of hair loss pathology, like the fibrosis that accumulates around hair follicles and prevents the regrowth of hair follicles when they're entering into a new anagen stage. This parafollicular fibrosis seems to get progressive as hair loss advances. And it's one thing that finasteride use doesn't really target very effectively. Finasteride targets the hormone DHT. But once that fibrosis sets in, you take away that DHT, you want to create an opportunity for that hair follicle to resize, but it's running out of real estate because fibrosis has set in, scar tissue has set in around that miniaturizing hair follicle. And so you need to address that component as well. So I looked into studies related to microneedling, and I saw that you could actually, through microneedling, improve scar tissue outcomes in the scalp and in the skin. The way that microneedling works is, for anybody who doesn't know what these devices are, they basically look like tiny medieval torture devices. They're little rollers with a bunch of spikes on them that are medical grade needles. And you roll them on your skin to elicit an inflammatory response that's acute. But in that elicitation of inflammation, you send signaling proteins that not only help to reduce scar tissue long term, or at least attenuate and partially reverse that scar tissue, but you also initiate antigen signalings that improve hair counts over time. And we've seen this over and over in the research now. Control groups for studies measuring microneedling plus minoxidil, whereby they just have a microneedling group, they also see increases to hair counts. And so you look at this research, you look at the pathologies of pattern hair loss, you look at all these opportunities to address these things a little bit more cleverly than a single drug, and you develop modalities around them. And for what worked for me, it sounds really stupid, sounds really simple, but it was scalp massages. It was massaging the perimeter of my scalp with my fingertips to really learn at an intimate level how these muscles were contracting and where to press, and then how to relax them. And then on top of that, pinching, pressing, and stretching exercises atop the scalp where I was thinning. And that helped to elicit new antigen signaling proteins. It helped to elicit the same inflammatory mechanisms that microneedling likely does. And in doing so, promote the growth of a new stage of the hair follicle, reduce the levels of, reduce the degree of fibrosis, presumably, and then lead to better hair increasing counts. So the crazy thing about this is that I'm explaining all of this, and you actually might be able to reduce DHT through these mechanisms. So this is totally hypothetical. This is totally, mechanistic, and there's no studies to support this. But technically speaking, DHT is a conversion from testosterone that does not require oxygen whatsoever. And when free testosterone has an opportunity to do something, it can either convert into estradiol, an estrogen, and that conversion is oxygen dependent, and estrogen is very pro-hair. Or it can convert to DHT through the 5-alpha reductase enzyme. Well, when these scalp muscles contract, they reduce blood flow to the top of the scalp because they pinch off the carotid arterial, the subarterial artery bands that then indirectly supply the top of the blood to the scalp. There was a study by Goldman in 1996 that demonstrated that transcutaneous oxygen levels to balding regions were 40% lower than non-balding controls. And his presumption is that this effect couldn't be explained by general hair follicle miniaturization itself. It had to be a physiological roadblock. And that the only thing that would explain this is the contraction of these scalp perimeter muscles that pinch off these carotid arterial branches and then lower blood supply to the top of the scalp. Well, you unpinch those carotid arteries, you do two things. First, you reduce scalp tension, so you have less of an inflammation-mediated DHT cascade. Second, you provide better blood flow to the top of the scalp, and in environments of better blood flow, free testosterone is going to start favoring the conversion not into DHT, but into estradiol. And so that's what I use to see improvements. That's what a lot of people who follow the research on our site use. We've published a peer-reviewed study in a dermatology journal about these massage techniques. It was survey-based, so it's not the highest quality, but it is something. And it seemed like people who adhered to these efforts for 8+ months, 75% of them reported either complete stabilization of their pattern hair loss, which again is a huge win, or some regrowth, with the degree of that hair regrowth varying. And so for people who are feeling trapped between these natural or conventional choices, there really are other options for you. And there's a lot of mechanistic data, anecdotal data, and soon to be clinical data to support a lot of these things that we're talking about.
It's really cool. And this is one of the things I love about doing medicine, is that we see patterns like this across so many disparate diseases. And it's so interesting to think like, oh, okay, this makes sense. If we eat a nutrient-rich diet, and if we think about, and I want to ask you this question next, why the scalp muscles might be contracted, where the stress is coming from, but we can just do basic things like either, dry needle with a device that's $20 on Amazon, or do scalp massage, or do things to allow the blood flow to go to the scalp, to even think about things that could improve endothelial function and allow this blood flow to go to the scalp, that we can reverse or improve so many of the chronic diseases. And I don't even know that we would consider androgenic alopecia to be a disease, but it's certainly a condition that affects men and women. We can reverse all these things, and the answer is often the same across multiple different pathologies, right? That's what's so interesting to me, and it kind of gets back to just the way that we live as humans, and it can be so simple. So this work is so valuable that you're doing. And as you're saying that, I had to use like all of my powers of control not to massage my own scalp, because you're talking about scalp massage, and I'm thinking, number one, I'm here in Costa Rica and I don't have anybody to massage my scalp. I'm going to have to like convince some friends, bribe some friends with something to get, like, we can trade scalp massages. But I mean, who doesn't like a scalp massage? And if there are techniques that we can use to actually, relax these frontalis muscles and relax these scalp muscles that could also help with hair, I think everybody's going to be on board with that. I can see plenty of husbands and wives trading scalp massages from now on. And these dry needling devices, we can put a link in the show notes or something. They're very cheap on Amazon, and you can run them over your head and perhaps create some inflammation that will result in positive changes at the level of the dermal papillae.